Episode 7. Thanks for being here, everybody. Welcome to Millennial in the Middle. I'm Connor Dehlin. Before I get started today, I just want to take the chance really quickly to say thank you for listening. We're about 3 weeks into this, and I started and I had a couple thoughts. One, how would people react to this? And two, my fear was I going to be able to have enough content? Was I going to have enough stuff to talk about that was going to be able to make this a consistent thing? And first off, your response, your reaction just continually blows me away. I can't tell you how much I enjoy, being out at work or whatever it might be and seeing a message come into my phone from someone I haven't seen or heard from in years and have them say, "Hey, Connor, I just started listening to your podcast. I'm a few episodes in. I love it. Keep doing what you're doing." That means so much to me. If you're enjoying this, please reach out. Please let me know. And I know I've said this before, but the only way this thing grows is if you share it. So, if you're listening right now and you haven't subscribed yet, hit subscribe. That makes a big difference to me. And also, if you feel so inclined, please share this with family, friends, make a Facebook post, share it in your Instagram story, whatever it might be. This really is picking up traction. I know it's all because of you. So thanks for those of you that have shared this already. For those of you that haven't, or share it again. Man, let's get this thing rolling. So thank you. And secondly, as far as the content goes, the first week was, had all these ideas and was trying to think of what I would talk about. And then all of a sudden, I feel like the floodgates just opened. And now my problem is, okay, I've got to have some patience in order so I don't just throw all of these episodes out at once, because I'm so excited about all the content that's coming up, so excited about some of the guests that I've got lined up, and we really are going to have a good time with this. So thanks for joining. Thanks for being a part of this journey. Let's jump into it. I feel like this week the election started. I know it's a little later than normal, but I feel like the presidential election really got started this week with Joe Biden announcing Kamala Harris as his VP pick. And I feel like, they made their first appearance speaking together. And it was like, okay, finally we're going to get into an election. Finally we're going to start to hear some debate. We're going to start hearing people talking about what they feel. And I think even though we may be a little late to the game of that because of coronavirus and how that's affected the world, I think we're about to start to enter that time of really hearing where the candidates stand, where our mindsets are at, and hopefully we have some good debate. Hopefully we have some good discussion about the issues that really matter to our country today. And what I want to talk about is an issue that I really wish, to be honest, would be debated more. I wish this is something that we would talk about more, because I really think it's so crucial, especially in the presidential election. Now, a lot of people, understandably, especially as I've started this podcast, they ask me a lot about, my personal opinions about what I feel about the election and what's going on and Trump and Biden and what do I think of Kamala Harris. And I love it. I'll give people my opinions and talk about it all day long. But the one thing I always tell people when they ask me about the president, I say, at the end of the day, I really don't feel the president has all that much power. There's a reason that we have checks and balances in place. The United States government is way bigger than one person. And I think that's proven, one person can't set the country off the rails, right? They can't change what we're doing so drastically that it really makes, often I think we take it so extreme when we talk specifically about the presidential election. If the president really did have that much power, Barack Obama would have totally led to universal health care. And if that were the case, Trump would have been elected and would have ripped it up and, destroyed it on day one, right? But obviously neither of those things happened because of the process that our founding fathers set in place with our government, with the Constitution. And, I think that's a good thing, obviously. But with that said, I think there are certain issues that the president has more control, or maybe influence is a better word, on certain issues than others. And the one place I feel the president has more control than really any other place is in foreign policy and in our relationship as a country with other countries. And that's really what I want to talk about today. Now, For those of you that just watched the Matt Townsend interview in episode 6, if you haven't, watch that after you finish listening to this episode. It was fantastic. Matt was awesome. Again, Matt, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate that. It was fun to see a lot of your fans and your followers listen and tune in and all of a sudden become fans of Millennial in the Middle. And one of the things we talked about, me and Matt, is the danger in the thinking in, just in a sense of dichotomies, right? It's all or nothing, one way or the other. It's black or white. And I think this is a topic that it's easy to put into one of those extreme dichotomies, but isn't that simple. And I want to talk about the difference today between globalism and nationalism. Now, I know that sounds really dry when I say that, but I think as we go through this, you're going to probably find this is maybe a little more interesting or hear about this in a different sense than you've thought about this before. And the other thing I hope to do with this today is to show you that, I always talk a lot about history in these podcasts, and I think we learn a lot as we look at our past and see what got us to the point we are today. And so what we're going to do with this topic is we're going to discuss, globalism versus nationalism in today's debate, but we're going to rewind the clock all the way back to George Washington, see what he said about this, and then everything in between. So for those of you that like the history side of this podcast, those of you that like learning new things and kind of being informed and learning some new anecdotes that you haven't heard before, this is your kind of episode. I think you'll really like this today. Now, quickly just to set the framework for what I mean when we talk about globalism versus nationalism. Let's first talk about nationalism, and let's talk about it because of that mindset we have that Donald Trump has given us. We've heard often him use the phrase, America first, right? America first. It's one of his campaign slogans. Again, it's fun to chant, right? What does that really mean? Well, in an article from a gentleman named Maham Abadi, who writes for Peace House, he said Trump's nationalism declaration, so recently what he's talking about is he said that he was a nationalist. Obviously, you could see from his actions and the things that he says that he would lean more that way, but recently Trump came out and said, I am a nationalist. And he said this didn't come as a surprise. Throughout Trump's presidency, Trump has championed the interests of the United States over more global concerns, saying he will put America first. He has spoken critically of various trade deals and pushed for greater limitations on immigration. He has also defended the concept of putting his country above others during speeches at the United Nations, an organization which seeks to have this unified global agenda. And in 2017, in a February speech, he said at the National Governors Association that he is a nationalist in a true sense, even though he noted that he still wants trade between two countries. So there's our nationalist side of the scale. Let's now look quickly at what globalism means as defined by Cambridge Dictionary. It's the idea that events in one country cannot be separated from those in another, and that economic and foreign policy should be planned in an international way. Now, as we look at the presidency specifically over the last several years, it's interesting that we've gone Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, right? We swing back and forth. And it is crazy in this two-party system that really our country is pretty divided as far as where people end up falling. And I think that Trump making this huge swing to more the nationalist side of this argument comes from Obama in a lot of ways being on more the globalist side of this argument. Obama was a visionary, right? I think in a lot of ways, Barack Obama had the desire to spread democracy, freedom, a global, making sure human rights violations, for example, were taken care of, and that America was going to stand as a leader in a global scale, from a global sense, right? And obviously, as we see, Republican, Democrat, Trump took the swing to the other side of the spectrum. Now, I think, unfortunately, like most things we talk about in this podcast, it's not that simple. You're not either a nationalist or a globalist. There's a way to still believe in America first and kind of what that idea represents, while at the same time still feeling that the United States is a global leader and should pay attention, knowing that the things that the United States does are going to have a massive effect on the world and citizens all over the globe, right? So with that said, I want to jump back to my favorite president. Now, we'll talk more about the current debate here at the end, but let's now rewind the clock, like I said, and talk about George Washington. Now, it probably shouldn't be a surprise to you by this time for me to tell you that George Washington is my favorite president. He's my man. I think so much of what he did set the foundation for who we are today and what America was going to be. And one of the things I think is most enticing about George Washington to me is that he didn't want power. He wasn't seeking the presidency. He wasn't political in his nature. He was a leader. He was a really good man. In fact, as we read this now, he had his flaws, he had his mistakes, like we talked about in episode 3. But history is history. We can't judge someone of yesterday by today's standards. And what George Washington did for our country absolutely earns him that title as the father of our nation. And one of the things that a lot of people don't know, and I guess I should say most people do know this, but for those of you that don't, is that when the Constitution was originally written, there weren't term limits for the president. So the term was 4 years, but there wasn't a hard set, you can only serve 2 terms and then you have to go and someone else comes into power. Now, when the Constitutional Convention was finished and the Constitution was ratified, there was no question at who was going to be the first president of our country, who our leader was going to be. It was the same man that had led us now for, through the American Revolution for 15 years, who we had looked up to, and no one had the same stature as him in the country at that time. So he was an easy pick. Now, after just one term, 4 years, George Washington wanted to step down. He was getting older. His health was starting to decline. And honestly, he needed a break, right? I mean, from the beginning of the Revolutionary War, he had been at the forefront of everything in the founding of our nation in this country. Now, with that said, he said at the end of his first term, 4 years, he wanted to step down, and he was talked out of it. Some of his chief aides and assistants, namely Thomas Jefferson in his cabinet, Alexander Hamilton in his cabinet, said, "You can't leave yet, we need you." So he agreed to serve a second term. And at the end of his second term, this time he wasn't going to let anyone talk him out of it. He said he was going to step down. And frankly, that decision shocked the world because we'd never seen anything like that up to this time. You had to remember that at that period in time, what people were used to was a king. And the only way a king stopped being king was they died, right? And even to take that the next step further, then who is the next king going to be? It was someone in their bloodline, their son or whoever it might be. And so this was completely different. That's why, the American experiment was something that people hadn't experienced before. To all of a sudden say, well, a president can step down. Why would you? You're on top. You're the leader. You're in charge. Why would you step down? And Washington was wise enough to know that the country that they had fought for, the country that they had set up, had to outlive him. That if it was all based on him and his stature and what he had done for the nation, what happened the minute he was gone? And Washington's fear was that he was going to die while he was president, because he knew that absolute mayhem and chaos would lead to after that, and he didn't know if the young nation could handle it. So he steps down. And as he stepped down, Washington then gave a farewell address. Now, this farewell address is, if you can handle the Old English and you like readings, old speeches, this speech is absolutely incredible. They always talk about that Washington set the precedent for what a president should do. And this really is what is found in Washington's farewell address, of these unreal precedents that we honestly are still living by and should be trying to live by. And I want to talk about a few of the main takeaways from his farewell address. And I think it's pretty crazy to see how timely this advice is. Now, I talk about, the musical Hamilton a lot in this podcast. Why? Because I'm a huge Hamilton fan. But secondly, I think it's important, what Lin-Manuel Miranda did, the creator and writer of Hamilton, was really impressive in that he brought history to millennials. He brought history to Gen Z, to the younger generations that didn't necessarily have a broad understanding or have a connection to history. All of a sudden, people were connecting with our nation's founding fathers and our history in a way they never had before. Kudos to him for doing that. And one of my favorite parts in Hamilton is the song One Last Time. After this podcast is over, go listen to it if you don't know it. But what's happening in this song is George Washington is basically explaining to Alexander Hamilton that he's stepping down and why he's stepping down. Alexander Hamilton is his protege. Alexander Hamilton looks to George Washington as a father figure, not just father figure of our nation, but personally as a father figure. And he tries to talk him out of it. Don't leave. The country's not going to be able to have any sort of leader that matches what you've been able to do for our country. And wisely, he explains why he's stepping down, and he says, help me write this speech. Pick up a pen, start writing, as the line says, right? And what he then says in this farewell address is fantastic. 3 different takeaways I want to talk about today. First off, he talked about the importance of unity. Now, I want to make a quick side note here. I mentioned in episode 5, the one where we talked about Donald Trump, made the McDonald's analogy. I said that Donald Trump wouldn't be allowed on this podcast because he couldn't live by the rules of this podcast. No divisiveness, no anger, there's no need to call names. He breaks all those rules. But I think it's safe to say that George Washington would be a huge fan of this podcast. Now, I know that sounds a little cocky to say, but I'm about to prove it to you. I think what we are trying to do with this podcast, George Washington would absolutely endorse, because in his essence, I really think he was a man in the middle. And throughout his life, he got really good at leading in the middle, bringing people from both sides together, finding compromise and using compromise as a way to move the nation forward and to progress. So it's not surprising that the first takeaway from his farewell address is when he stresses the importance of unity. Now, what's so cool about this farewell address is how he positions it. He says, these are the warnings of a parting friend who can possibly have no personal motive to bias his counsel. What he's saying is, I'm stepping into retirement. I'm walking into the sunset. There's nothing really for me to gain in telling you this other than a parting friend who wants the best for you and this nation. He went on later to say, in offering to you, my countrymen, these counsels of an old and affectionate friend, I dare not hope they will make the strong and lasting impression I could wish, that they will control the usual current of passions or prevent our nation from running the course which has hitherto marked the destiny of nations. Basically saying, I don't want us to fall into the same trap and make the same mistakes that other civilizations have made. I want to give you some advice, and if you follow this, I think this will help keep you on track. Now, after he talks about why he's stepping down, he basically inspires them to unity by saying, you have in a common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint counsels and joint efforts of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. Regions such as the North, South, East, and West should see their common interests rather than their differences. Does that mindset sound familiar? What's funny is as I started reading Washington's farewell address, I felt like it was many of the lines that I just said in my intro episode, and I talked about with Dr. Townsend, right? We've got a whole lot more in common than we do different, and George Washington says, before you are anything else, remember that you are an American. Remember that you have fought for this common cause of liberty and justice, and together you've triumphed. Together you've won. And what's interesting is, during the time of the Revolutionary War, there was an enemy, right? We were fighting for our independence from Britain. But now what did George Washington started to see? Now we were on our own. And so what did people naturally start doing? There wasn't a common enemy, so we started fighting each other. And he says we need to lay those differences aside and we need to come together. So the first he says, avoid that sectionalism, the mindset of, I'm a Virginian before I'm an American. I'm a Texan before I'm an American, right? I'm a Southerner. No, we're all Americans. We're all in this together, and we all got to move forward. Now he says, one of the chief dangers of letting regional loyalties dominate loyalty to the nation as a whole was that it would lead to factionalism, or the development of competing political parties. When Americans voted according to party loyalty rather than the common interest of the nation, Washington feared it would foster a spirit of revenge and enable the rise of cunning and excuse me, I want to say this purely because this is so important here. When Americans voted according to party loyalty rather than the common interest of the nation, Washington feared it would foster a spirit of revenge and enable the rise of cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men who would usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. Think about that. This was almost 250 years ago that George Washington basically comes together and says, look, if we totally buy into these political parties, it will allow cunning, ambitious, unprincipled men to rise to the top, to usurp for themselves the reins of government, and then destroy the justice and the form of government that got them there in the first place. Man, that is some serious advice for 2020 right there. The first two takeaways from Washington's farewell address: remember that you've got to be unified and be an American first, and two, avoid political parties. Now, as he went on, he said, one of the other things I fear is foreign entanglements. Now, he warns of the danger of foreign entanglements, and I want to explain what that means. But what he said is that a foreign policy based on neutrality was the safest way to maintain national unity and stability in the U.S. Although Washington saw the need for the nation to involve itself in foreign affairs in the case of war or another emergency, he argued that it must steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. So George Washington understood at this point that the nation was young, that we couldn't involve ourselves in foreign affairs, that we couldn't all of a sudden get caught up in all the squabbles that were happening over in Europe, all the fightings that were happening in different places of the world. We had to protect ourselves first. Now, I kind of compare this to the airplane oxygen analogy, if you will. We've all been on the airplane before when they start going through the safety protocols, right? And you hear them say, in case of loss of oxygen, you'll see the oxygen mask come from above your head. Make sure to put your own mask on before helping others or children around you. This is what George Washington understood at this point. He said, look, we're not ready to start helping out all these other nations. Why? Because we need to make sure that our affairs are in order first. We need to make sure that we are self-sufficient before we're trying to help other countries in Europe. And this became U.S. policy. For the next really like 150 years, the United States started to live under this mentality that we weren't going to get involved in foreign affairs throughout the world. And we were able to do it. Frankly, we were able to do it really well. And one of the reasons I think for that, or there were two things that allowed the United States to live by George Washington's final advice in his farewell address. Now, these two things were the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Now, I say that kind of facetiously, but the point really stands in that one of the greatest benefits the young United States had is that we were isolated from the rest of the world. It took weeks for information to even travel from Europe to America across the Atlantic Ocean. And we really benefited from this mentality of being isolated. We were on an island of sorts. And so it allowed us the chance to get the ground under our feet, to get our nation rolling, to get up and coming to where all of a sudden we did have a place on the world stage. And while other countries were squabbling and having little arguments or wars or whatever it might be, we were able to stay out of a lot of this. Now, in fact, George Washington actually lived by this mentality while he was in office. While he was in office, the French Revolution began. And Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of State at time, came to George Washington and said, we need to step in and help out France. Now, his argument was really good. Why did we need to help France? Because they helped us. He said, man, how short term is your memory? Remember when we were struggling and France stepped in and helped us? The Battle of Yorktown, they helped us win the American Revolution? And George Washington said, we're not ready to get involved in that type of affair. And he lived by that mentality of, I think what society would call it today, of this America first. We weren't ready to step into the global scheme of things. Now, what happened over time? We lived by that policy for 150 years, like I stated earlier. If you look at the 1800s, the 19th century, we didn't get involved in any foreign wars. I mean, the only major war we really fought in the 1800s was a civil war. It was against ourselves, right? And what happened, though, is the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean started to shrink. Now, no, this isn't an argument about global warming. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But as technology increased and as the world became more and more connected, the distance and the safety provided from the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean of us between the rest of the world started to diminish. And what started happening is the United States started playing more of a role in the global picture. And really, the first time the United States started to change this policy or went against Washington's last words in his farewell address was World War I. Now, Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1914, about the same time that World War I started in Europe. And Woodrow Wilson ran his campaign preaching that we were going to stay neutral. We were not going to get involved in that European war. We were going to stay far, far away from it. And frankly, we did a really good job at that for the first part of the war. And after time, Germany started to, there were many events. Germany started to pull us into the war. We started getting attacked. Different things we'll talk about later. I'm actually going to do a full podcast on World War I at some point. Why? Because I feel like everyone knows their World War II history pretty well, but we all forget World War I. And in my opinion, World War II makes a whole heck of a lot more sense when you understand World War I. But I'm getting off track. What we're discussing here is that Woodrow Wilson was then faced with that decision of, do I step in to World War I? Do we have to join? Do we have to help out? And one of the things that's an interesting side note here is it was really difficult in World War I to even decide what side we wanted to be on. Now, World War II, we've talked about this before. It's really easy in World War II to decide who the good guys and who the bad guys are. World War I wasn't as plain and simple. Germany was an upstart nation. They were trying to gain more power in Europe. They were sick of France and Britain having these large empires and all this power, and they wanted in on that. The other interesting thing to note is there was a good percentage of Americans in the U.S. at that time that were German. A lot of them at this period maybe had just immigrated one or two generations before, or maybe they themselves were the immigrants. A lot of them still spoke German, still read German newspapers. And so the thought of going to war with your homeland, where you still had family, friends, neighbors, that wasn't a thought that it sat very well at all. And so the U.S. tried really, really hard not to pick sides and not to get involved. Well, in 1917, that really wasn't an option anymore. The United States declares war, they join the war, and really, Joyce just joined for the tail end of the war. And in 1918, Woodrow Wilson basically leads the charge in creating the League of Nations. And what the League of Nations did as they were trying to create the peace treaties to end World War I was to make sure that wars like this didn't happen again, that we didn't find ourselves in these types of scenarios. In fact, World War I was often billed or labeled as the war to end all wars. Now, we know that wasn't the case, unfortunately. But that really was the design to let's make sure we then set up a world, a global relationship here that's not going to let something like this happen again. Well, just 20 years later, all of a sudden the world starts getting pulled into a very similar situation, and Germany decides, hey, it didn't work the first time, but let's do it again, run it back. And what's interesting is even in World War II, the United States tried really hard to stay out of it again. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st of 1939. The United States didn't enter World War II until December of 1941, more than 2 years later. And what was the event? What was the action that led the United States of that last straw to jump in World War II? It was from Pearl Harbor that happened the day before. We were attacked on our own homeland, our own soil. And if we were going to declare war on Japan, there was really no choice. We had to enter the World War, and we were in it again. Now, in World War I think we kind of tested the waters of jumping into these foreign conflicts, jumping into these foreign affairs. In World War II, we confirmed that decision, and we put ourselves on a path that the United States hasn't been able to get off since. At the end of World War II, we then enter the Cold War, which, by the way, we're going to do a podcast episode on as well because I'm fascinated with the Cold War history. But basically this mindset that the spread of communism, even if it wasn't on United States soil or within our borders, had a direct effect on the United States. That was the argument, that there was this fight between democracy and freedom and socialism and communism. And so what happened? The United States started getting involved in foreign affairs in ways that they never had before. Look at the wars that are then fought shortly thereafter, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, which we've talked a lot about, and we will talk more about as this podcast goes on. But we started sending our troops to fight for other countries. We started getting involved in foreign affairs as a way to preempt it getting to us, right? And this mentality is now what has dominated the United States foreign policy for years, right? We now look at a lot of the current wars that we have fought, or the current way that we interact and socialize with other nations, and we see that we are very, very far from George Washington's advice that he gave to us in the 1790s. Now, I am not advocating today that we need to go back to what George Washington said and let's just America first, close the borders, let's stick to ourselves, everyone else, good luck. Because obviously it's really foolish and really naive to think that the world today is even similar to what it was in the 1790s. In fact, it's been said, I read this quote, that to deny globalization and globalism is as if you were arguing with the laws of gravity, that there's just no stopping it. In fact, Barack Obama, I want to read you a quote here. Barack Obama, if I can find it, here we go. He said, globalization is a fact because of technology, because of an integrated global supply chain, because of changes in transportation. And we're not going to be able to build a wall around that. Now, here's where I find myself somewhere in the middle. I love George Washington. I think our country would be a lot better off if we just listened to the advice that he gave us. But I do also understand that the world landscape is so much different than it was in the time that he was president. And I also believe in that old adage, where much is given, much is required. And that's how I feel about the United States of America. You know, I love this country. I'm proud to be an American, and I feel we are all blessed for either living here, being born here, having the chance, like whatever it might be. We are very blessed to enjoy the freedoms that we have and the system of government that we have here in this nation. And with that, we find ourselves in a unique position as leaders that we can bring peace, that we can bring freedom, democracy to the world. There are times when there are human rights violations that no one else is going to step up and help. And if it's got to be us to do it, really there's no one better to do it, because we're the United States of America, where much is given, much is required. But there's got to be that balance. If we find ourselves, like George Washington said, aligning with other nations and creating, these alliances where all of a sudden we're working together, that's a foreign entanglement. Or if we find ourselves getting involved in all of these foreign affairs, the problem that suddenly starts to happen is, where do you draw the line of what directly benefits the United States or where there's some self-interest involved as well? Now, I know we could get into lots of conversations. We could talk about the Iraq War. We could talk about Afghanistan. We could talk about how Trump, comes in and what he's done with the Iran nuclear deal, or the Paris climate treaty, right? It's complex. It's simple. I think, like Dr. Townsend said in the last episode, episode 6, he said, when we get in trouble is when we assume simplicity. What we always have to do to lead to more valuable conversation is assume complexity. This is an extremely complicated situation. There isn't a right answer, and there's not a one way or another. Am I a nationalist? Yes. Am I a globalist? Yes. I believe in a lot of the mindsets and a lot of the theories of both of these two things. And what do you have to do when you're in the middle? You've got to understand where you've come from. You've got to understand the current climate of where things are now. And in the middle, you can't stay undecided as well. I always talk about being in the middle doesn't mean you're undecided. It doesn't mean you're neutral. It doesn't mean you're a fence sitter. It means that you've got to realize there are a lot of opinions in lots of different matters, and you've got to have a broader understanding to be able to make up your mind. So, in closing, like I said, I feel like the election is kind of kicked off this week, and I hope that as you're watching the debates or as you're reading the news or listening to speeches given by the candidates, think about where do they stand in this globalist versus nationalist mentality, because the president does have a big hand in the way our country is viewed, our perspective internationally, and the things that we do in how we interact with other nations. So it should be something that you're paying attention to, and hopefully this little brief history has given you a little more understanding as you go into it. Thanks for listening. We've got some awesome episodes coming up, some really cool interviews. If you've got any ideas for topics, if you've got anything you'd like to hear more about or learn a little bit about, send me a message. I'm all ears. This is for you. We're all in this together. And until next time, clowns to the left me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. See you next time.